A billionaire CEO receives a court summons. A woman is suing him for child support. At first, he laughs it off with his associates, until his assistant hands him a picture of the child, prompting everyone to freeze in shock. The little boy in the picture looks exactly like him. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Oliver Jones leaned back in his leather office chair, the skyline of Manhattan glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. The walls of his office exuded power, awards, framed business magazine covers with his face on them, sleek black bookshelves filled with first editions. He thrived on control, precision, and predictability. But nothing could have prepared him for the crisp manila envelope that sat in front of him. A paternity lawsuit? He scoffed, shaking his head as he flipped through the document. You'd think these people would get more creative. Across from him, his closest executives exchanged amused glances. Oliver had seen it all before: gold diggers, desperate ex-flings looking for a payout, people hoping to cash in on his wealth. It was part of the job when your name was synonymous with success. He tossed the papers onto his desk like they were nothing more than an inconvenience. His assistant, Lauren, shifted uncomfortably at his side, her fingers tightening around a folder she had yet to hand over. Unlike the others in the room, she wasn't smiling. Oliver noticed the hesitation in her stance, the way she seemed to weigh her next words. She'd been with him long enough to know that any sign of uncertainty irritated him. "What?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Lauren hesitated before stepping forward. "Sir? There's something else." She slid the folder onto his desk and flipped it open. Inside, a single photograph lay atop a stack of legal documents. Oliver's smirk faltered the second his eyes landed on the image. The boy was small, maybe 5 years old, with a mop of dark hair and sharp blue eyes, the exact same shade as his own. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was uncanny. A miniature version of himself stared back at him, an expression of quiet curiosity frozen in time. His breath caught for a second, something foreign twisting in his chest. The room went silent. The amusement that had filled the space just moments before evaporated. The executives, sensing the sudden change in mood, exchanged glances and slowly backed away, murmuring half-hearted excuses as they filed out. Oliver didn't move, didn't speak. He could feel Lauren watching him, waiting for a reaction. "Where did this come from?" His voice was quieter now, the arrogance from earlier stripped away. "The mother, Emma Carter, included it with the lawsuit. She claims you met 6 years ago, had a brief relationship, and I don't even know who this woman is." Oliver cut in, finally snapping out of his daze. He shoved the folder shut and leaned back in his chair, forcing out a laugh, though it didn't come as easily as before. "This is ridiculous. Anyone can send a picture of some kid and say he's mine." Lauren didn't react, her expression unreadable. "I've already scheduled a meeting with legal. They recommend a paternity test." Oliver scoffed. "No. I'm not entertaining this. She wants money, that's all." Lauren nodded but didn't immediately move to leave. She knew him well enough to sense when something had gotten under his skin, and this had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. When she finally stepped out of the office, Oliver exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. His heart was still beating faster than it should have been. It was absurd. There was no way he would remember something like that. Wouldn't he? He had been with plenty of women before Matilda, but nothing serious. No relationships that lasted beyond a handful of months. Names and faces blurred together over the years. Could there have been an Emma Carter somewhere in his past? Shoving the thought away, he turned back to his desk and distracted himself with work. But the document sat there, taunting him from the edge of his vision. The longer he tried to ignore it, the more his mind betrayed him, drifting back to the image of the little boy. Hours later, when the office had emptied and the city below had turned to a sea of lights, Oliver found himself still staring at the folder. He picked it up and flipped it open again, his fingers brushing against the photograph. His own reflection stared back at him through the boy's features, and for the first time, he felt something he couldn't quite name. A seed of doubt. Oliver barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the boy burned in his mind. He told himself it was a coincidence, that there were plenty of kids in the world who resembled their fathers without actually being related. But the unease in his chest wouldn't go away. He arrived at the office earlier than usual the next morning, hoping to drown himself in work and push the entire situation out of his head, but Lauren was waiting for him outside his office, expression unreadable. "The legal team is ready whenever you are," she said, holding a thick file in her hands. Oliver exhaled sharply and walked past her. "Not now. You can't ignore this, Oliver," she said, following him inside and shutting the door. "Emma Carter is prepared to take this public if you don't respond. A paternity test is the easiest way to prove you have nothing to do with the child." Oliver sat down at his desk, pressing his fingers to his temples. The last thing he needed was a scandal, but taking the test meant acknowledging the possibility that the boy could be his. He wasn't ready for that. He glanced at the photograph again. The resemblance gnawed at him, and the doubt that had planted itself in his mind the night before refused to fade. But there was another way out of this, a way that didn't require him to deal with it himself. He looked up at Lauren. "What if she's lying about who the father is?" Lauren frowned. "You think she made a mistake?" Oliver leaned back in his chair, considering his next words carefully. "No. I think she knows exactly what she's doing. But what if she's not after me? What if she's after my brother?" Lauren's expression didn't change, but he caught the slight narrowing of her eyes. "You think Daniel is the father?" Oliver shrugged. "He's the married one. The responsible one. The one with the perfect family. Maybe he had an affair and she's trying to pin it on me because it's easier to target a bachelor than a family man." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's a serious accusation, Oliver. I'm just saying it makes sense. She could have been with both of us and assumed I was the easier target." Lauren hesitated, but before she could respond, Oliver pulled out his phone and dialed his brother's number. It rang twice before Daniel picked up. "Oliver?" His voice was groggy, like he'd just woken up. "Hey, I need to talk to you. Can you come by the office?" Daniel sighed. "It's barely 7 in the morning. What's this about?" Oliver hesitated for half a second, then said, "I think someone's trying to frame one of us for something, and I need to clear it up." There was a brief pause before Daniel muttered something under his breath. "Fine. I'll be there in an hour." Oliver hung up and turned to Lauren. "See? If I'm wrong, he'll say so. But if I'm right, then this whole mess is his problem, not mine." Lauren didn't respond. Instead, she walked out, leaving him alone with his thoughts. An hour later, Daniel stepped into the office, dressed in his usual sharp suit but with a slight air of exhaustion around him. Unlike Oliver, Daniel had settled into a quieter life, married to his college sweetheart, Rachel, and raising 2 kids in a suburban estate just outside the city. He was everything Oliver wasn't: steady, reliable, devoted. Oliver wasted no time. He slid the folder across the desk, watching as Daniel picked it up and flipped through the documents. When he reached the photograph, his brows furrowed. "What is this?" Daniel asked, looking up. Oliver crossed his arms. "A woman is suing me for child support. Claims I'm the father of her kid." Daniel's expression didn't shift. "And?" Oliver leaned forward. "Look at him. Really look at him." Daniel studied the photograph again, and for a split second, Oliver thought he saw something flicker across his face: confusion, maybe even doubt. Oliver seized the moment. "You ever meet a woman named Emma Carter?" Daniel blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What?" "No. She claims the boy is mine, but I don't even remember her. What if she's mistaken? What if he's not mine? But yours?" The accusation hung heavy in the air. Daniel's expression hardened as he dropped the folder onto the desk. "Are you serious right now?" Oliver kept his tone even. "Think about it. You travel for work, just like I do. Maybe you had a lapse in judgment. Maybe. Daniel slammed his hands on the desk. I did not cheat on my wife, Oliver. The anger in his voice was sharp, raw, and Oliver felt the first stirrings of unease. You really think I'd do that to Rachel? To my family? Daniel continued, his voice quieter now, but no less furious. I think mistakes happen, Oliver said smoothly. And if it was a mistake, I'll help you handle it. But if it was me, wouldn't I remember? Daniel's jaw clenched. Maybe you wouldn't. You've had a hell of a lot more forgettable nights than I have. The air between them grew tense, the weight of the accusation settling between them like a thick fog. Daniel grabbed his phone and dialed his wife. Rachel, can you come to Oliver's office? No. Oliver raised an eyebrow. What are you doing? I'm going to prove you wrong, Daniel snapped. 30 minutes later, Rachel arrived, confusion written all over her face. The second Daniel handed her the folder, the color drained from her cheeks. What is this? She whispered, looking between them. Oliver expected Daniel to explain calmly, to assure her it was a misunderstanding. But instead, Daniel's face darkened with something Oliver hadn't anticipated, hurt. Oliver thinks I cheated on you, Daniel said, voice heavy. He thinks this child is mine. Rachel's eyes widened, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the photograph. Is this true? Daniel shook his head firmly. No. I swear to you, Rachel, I have never cheated. Not once. But the damage was done. Oliver could see it in Rachel's face, the hesitation, the creeping doubt. Rachel, come on, Daniel said, reaching for her hand. You know me. I do, she whispered. But her eyes stayed locked on the photo. Oliver leaned back, satisfied. Whether or not his accusation was true, it had done its job. The attention was off him now. But as Rachel pulled her hand away from Daniel's grasp and stepped back, Oliver felt an unexpected pang of something he hadn't anticipated. Guilt. The silence in the room was suffocating. Rachel stood frozen, gripping the photograph as if it held the answer to a question she was too afraid to ask. Daniel kept his gaze locked on her, his voice quieter now, desperate. Rachel, please. You know me. You know I would never. She took a step back. I thought I knew a lot of things. The words hit Daniel harder than any slap. Oliver expected him to keep fighting, to throw more arguments at her, to insist. Instead, Daniel's shoulders sagged, and he exhaled sharply, like the weight of the accusation had finally settled in. He turned back to Oliver, eyes burning with betrayal. You did this, he said, voice shaking. You couldn't handle your own mess, so you threw it at me. And now you've ruined my family. Oliver's stomach twisted, but he shoved the feeling down. I didn't ruin anything. I just pointed out the possibility. If you're innocent, then prove it. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You really think that's how this works? Doubt doesn't need proof. You planted the seed, and now Rachel's going to question every late night, every business trip, every missed call. Even if I take a damn paternity test and prove this kid isn't mine, the damage is already done. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. I need time to think. Daniel turned to her, desperation creeping into his tone. Think about what? Rachel, I love you. I love our kids. I have never once. She flinched, like his words hurt to hear. Then, with a shaking breath, she turned and walked out of the office, the photograph still clutched in her hands. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his breathing uneven. Then, without another word, he followed her. Oliver watched them go, feeling the tension in his chest loosen slightly. It was done. The focus was off him. If Daniel was innocent, Rachel would figure that out soon enough. But if there was even the slightest chance, a sharp knock on his desk made him look up. Lauren stood there, arms crossed, disappointment etched all over her face. That was low, she said. Oliver's jaw tightened. I did what I had to do. She shook her head and walked out without another word. Rachel left that night. She took the kids and went to stay with her sister, leaving Daniel alone in the house they had built together. He called her repeatedly, sent texts, left voicemails, but she barely responded. When she did, her answers were short, distant. He told her he'd take a test, that he'd prove the child wasn't his, but she didn't say whether that would fix anything. The fact that she even had to ask herself that question meant something between them had already broken. Daniel didn't go to work the next day, or the day after that. Oliver tried to ignore the gnawing guilt, but it was easier said than done. His phone calls to Daniel went unanswered. His texts were read but not replied to. By the third day, he started to feel a crack in his confidence. On the fourth day, Daniel stormed into Oliver's office, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His tie was loose, his suit wrinkled, so unlike the brother who was always put together. But his eyes were sharp, and they burned with anger. "You destroyed my marriage," Daniel said, voice low but filled with venom. Oliver sat back in his chair, feigning calm. "Rachel overreacted. She'll come around." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about the accusation. It's about trust. You didn't just put doubt in her head, you made her question everything. And she's not wrong to." He stepped closer, leaning on Oliver's desk. "You couldn't handle the truth, so you threw me under the bus. You ruined my life because you were too much of a coward to deal with your own." Oliver clenched his jaw. "I didn't ruin anything. You and Rachel will work it out." Daniel's expression darkened. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to pretend this is just some minor inconvenience." His voice dropped even lower, filled with quiet fury. "I don't ever want to see you again." Oliver's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to hold Daniel's gaze. "You're being dramatic." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle and shook his head. "You're not worth it, Oliver. You never were." Then he turned and walked out, and this time, Oliver knew he wouldn't come back. The media got hold of the lawsuit within days. Headlines splashed across news sites, questioning the legitimacy of the claim. Some painted Oliver as the victim of a gold digger, others as a reckless billionaire who abandoned his responsibilities. Reporters dug into Emma Carter's past, trying to uncover the truth. But the more they looked into her, the more Oliver's confidence wavered. There was no history of her seeking money from wealthy men. No suspicious financial activity. No scandals or ulterior motives. And when an old photograph surfaced, a blurry image of Oliver and Emma together at an event 6 years ago, his stomach dropped. Lauren dropped the magazine onto his desk. "You said you didn't know her." Oliver stared at the image, unable to respond. "You're running out of people to blame," she continued. "Daniel's done with you. Rachel might never trust him again. Your reputation is tanking. So maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop pretending this isn't your problem." Oliver set the magazine down and let out a slow breath. But he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. There had to be another explanation. Something he was missing. Because if he admitted the truth now, then he'd have to accept the consequences. And for a man who built his empire on control, the idea of his life unraveling terrified him more than anything. Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a way out. There always was. His entire life, he had built his empire on control of his company, his reputation, his image. This situation would be no different. There had to be a loophole, a miscalculation, something Emma Carter had lied about. Sitting in his office with the blinds drawn shut, he combed through every detail of the case file, every piece of evidence, every word in the lawsuit. The photograph of the child, Leo, sat on his desk, but he kept it face down, unwilling to let his mind wander too far into dangerous territory. He refused to entertain the possibility that this woman might be telling the truth. His phone buzzed. "Mr. Jones?" His lawyer, James Whitmore, greeted in his usual clipped tone. "We've started looking into Ms. Carter's background. So far, nothing unusual. No history of financial fraud, no other paternity claims, no questionable bank transactions." Oliver clenched his jaw. "You're telling me she's squeaky clean?" James hesitated. "For now, yes. But we're digging deeper. We also reached out to her legal team regarding a paternity test. They agreed to it. Oliver exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers against the desk. Then I want additional DNA tests done. Make sure there's no chance of error. And while we're at it, get private investigators on her. There has to be something. There was a brief pause before James said, "Understood." The call ended, and Oliver leaned back in his chair, his mind working at full speed. If the investigators didn't find anything on Emma, then maybe she was lying about something else. Maybe she had been involved with other men around the same time. Maybe Leo only resembled him by coincidence. Maybe. But the doubt was still there, clawing at the edges of his certainty, poisoning his thoughts. Later that night, when Oliver returned home, Matilda was waiting for him. She was curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, her dark eyes scanning him as he walked in. "You're late," she said, her voice unreadable. He shrugged off his jacket and poured himself a drink. "Busy day." She set her glass down. "I saw the news." Oliver's grip tightened around the glass, but he forced himself to stay calm. "The media loves to twist things. You know that. Do they?" Matilda studied him carefully. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they're reporting exactly what's happening." Oliver took a slow sip of his drink. "I didn't cheat on you, Matilda. The kid is 5 years old. We've been married for 3. You know that." "I do." Her voice was steady. "But that's not what this is about, is it?" His chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Matilda stood up and walked over to him, crossing her arms. "I mean, I've been watching you. The way you've handled this. The way you immediately pointed fingers at Daniel, destroyed his marriage, dragged his name through the mud just to protect yourself. And now you're trying to tear this woman apart, hoping you'll find something, anything, that makes her the villain." She tilted her head. "Tell me, Oliver. What happens if you don't?" He held her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "That won't happen." Matilda sighed and looked away, rubbing her temple. "You don't even hear yourself, do you?" Oliver set his glass down harder than necessary. "You think I should just roll over and accept this? Let some woman dictate my life because she says so? I think," she said, turning back to him, "that you're so obsessed with controlling everything around you that you refuse to consider the possibility that this isn't a battle you can win." Oliver opened his mouth, but she cut him off. "You keep throwing money at the problem, hoping it'll disappear, but this isn't some corporate deal, Oliver. This is a child. A human being. And whether or not he's yours, you're handling this like a scandal to be buried, not like a man who actually cares about the truth." Oliver's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I care about the truth." "No," Matilda said softly. "You care about yourself." For a brief moment, silence filled the room. The weight of her words settled deep in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He had spent years building an impenetrable wall, and he wasn't about to let it crack now. Without another word, Matilda turned and walked upstairs, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room. The next morning, the results from his private investigators came in. Oliver skimmed through them, his grip tightening with every page he flipped. There was nothing. No questionable financial history. No affairs. No evidence of Emma Carter being anything but a normal woman who had raised a child on her own for 5 years. It wasn't enough. He took his frustration out in the courtroom, where his legal team hammered away at Emma's credibility, questioning everything about her. Who had she been involved with back then? Could she be sure it was Oliver's child? Was she really in a stable financial position to take care of a child, or was she seeking a payout? Emma sat there, silent, composed, enduring every accusation thrown her way. And then, when it was her turn to speak, she looked straight at Oliver. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I never did. I raised my son without you. I'm only here because he deserves the truth. And so do you." Oliver said nothing. Because for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear it. Oliver sat in his office long after the courtroom emptied, staring at the polished surface of his desk without really seeing it. Emma's words played in his mind on a loop. I don't want your money. I never did. I raised my son without you. I'm only here because he deserves the truth. And so do you. He had expected her to crack under pressure, to slip up, to reveal some hidden agenda. Instead, she had sat there, unwavering, while he had flailed desperately, grasping at anything to discredit her. And now, for the first time since this nightmare began, doubt wasn't just creeping in, it was suffocating him. His phone buzzed. A text from Matilda. We need to talk. Oliver exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He already knew what this was about. Matilda had barely spoken to him in the last few days, and when she did, there was an edge to her voice, a quiet resignation that he had tried to ignore. By the time he got home, the sight of a half-packed suitcase in their bedroom confirmed everything. Matilda stood by the closet, methodically folding clothes into neat stacks, her face unreadable. You're leaving, Oliver said, his voice flat. She didn't stop packing. I should have left sooner. A sharp pang shot through his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. So that's it? You're giving up? She turned, her dark eyes filled with something that wasn't anger anymore, it was exhaustion. No, Oliver. You gave up. On honesty. On integrity. On everything that mattered more than your pride. She gestured vaguely around them. This house, your money, your company, you always thought those things made you untouchable. But look at you now. You're scrambling, desperate to prove something that deep down, you already know isn't true. His jaw clenched. I never cheated on you. I know that, she said quietly. That's not the point. The point is, you had a child and never even considered the possibility that it might be yours. You humiliated your brother, destroyed his marriage, dragged a woman through the mud, and for what? To protect your ego? Oliver felt a cold weight settle in his chest, but he refused to acknowledge it. So you're just walking away? I can't stay and watch you become someone I don't recognize. She zipped up her suitcase and looked at him one last time. And I don't think you'll recognize yourself when this is all over either. She walked past him, pulling the suitcase behind her. He didn't stop her. He told himself it was because she had already made up her mind, that there was no point in arguing. But deep down, he knew the truth. She was right. The next few days were a blur. He threw himself into work, but the weight pressing down on him was impossible to ignore. His office felt emptier, his home even worse. Every time he walked past their bedroom, he was hit with the absence of her things, her perfume no longer lingering in the air, the quiet hum of her evening routine now replaced with silence. And then there was Daniel. His brother had cut off all contact. No calls, no texts. Rachel was staying with her sister, still refusing to speak to him. If there was any hope of repairing their marriage, Oliver had crushed it under the weight of his accusations. Even at work, the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. The board was worried. Investors were skittish. The press had turned him into the headline of the week. Billionaire CEO dodges paternity suit, drags brother's marriage into chaos. He sat through meeting after meeting where the topic wasn't innovation or expansion but damage control. His PR team had scrambled to contain the situation, but it was a losing battle. The more he tried to push back, the worse it got. It was only when his mother called that it finally hit him just how much he had lost. Oliver. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it he hadn't heard since he was a teenager. I need to know something, and I need you to tell me the truth. He rubbed his temple. Mom, if this is about the lawsuit, is he yours? His throat went dry. You don't have to answer, she continued when he stayed silent. Because I already know. I saw the picture. I don't need a test to tell me what's right in front of my face. Oliver exhaled, pressing his fingers against his desk. It's not that simple. It is that simple, she snapped. But you made it complicated. You turned it into a war, and in the process you lost your wife, your brother, your dignity. You should be ashamed. The word hit him like a slap. His mother had never spoken to him like that. Not even when he was a reckless teenager pushing boundaries. "Oliver," she said after a long silence, her voice softer this time. "I don't know what kind of man I raised. I thought I knew. But right now, I don't recognize you." The call ended, leaving him sitting there, staring blankly at the screen. That night, for the first time in years, Oliver didn't go home to his penthouse. He didn't go to a bar, didn't surround himself with distractions. Instead, he found himself in his car, parked outside the house where Daniel and Rachel had once lived together. The porch light was off. The driveway empty. He had always believed that no matter what happened, no matter how bad things got, he could fix them. Throw money at the problem. Make a deal. Find a way out. But there was no out this time. His wife was gone. His brother had cut him off. His mother had told him she was ashamed of him. For the first time in his life, Oliver Jones had no one left in his corner. And for the first time, he realized he had done it to himself. Oliver sat in his office long after everyone had gone home, staring at the unopened envelope on his desk. The paternity test results. The answer he had spent weeks avoiding. It had arrived hours ago, hand-delivered by his attorney, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to look. He ran a hand over his face, his temples pounding. The silence in the room felt heavier than ever, like the walls were closing in on him. He had